I've talked a lot recently about the fact that the United States of America has finally done away with our 1 cent coin after a couple of hundred years of having this. In fact, the United States Mint even released a very special final circulating 1 cent coin with a special privy mark on it, an omega stamp, symbolizing that that was the last of the cents we were going to produce for circulation. And the Mint went so far as to strike a solid gold penny to go along with these examples, and these pieces were sold to very elite coin collectors and dealers via a private auction house. I've got a series of videos that I did about that. You'll find it down below if you're interested. But that got me thinking about the concept of debasement. So this video is going to be about the concept of reducing the quality of the precious metals in a particular coin. We call that debasement, and I think it is particularly pertinent in an era where we are getting rid of some of our coins and so many people are coming into the physical precious metals market. This definitely will apply to some of the pieces that you may be looking at. The idea of debasement. If you are new to the channel, my name is Dub C, and I want to thank you for spending some time with me here, especially if you are brand new to collecting coins or physical precious metals. This is a really exciting and fun hobby. I'm glad to have you here. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, I'd love to have you go ahead and click on that subscription button. Become part of this community. It doesn't cost anything to subscribe to a channel. It's just a way to show support. And if you're one of my returning subscribers, you're going to know some of this. Hopefully we'll touch on some things that you haven't seen before. But we'll also talk about some really cool silver and gold coins, so this is going to be a fun ride. Strap in. If you are new to the channel, I like to begin my videos with a simple disclaimer. I am not a financial advisor. I'm not trying to give you any kind of financial advice. I'm simply trying to share some of my experience having bought and sold precious metals and rare coins for the last 30 or 40 years. I also wanted to point out, now that I have about 300 videos on my channel, that there is a search function that you can find on the front page of my YouTube channel. This is a really easy to use piece of technology. You just type in a word that you are interested in finding out more about, and YouTube will provide you with several of my videos that pertain to whatever it is you're interested in. I actually find myself doing this more and more. Now that I have so many videos, sometimes I need to remember where I had stuck information about a particular coin or precious metal. So I use this function myself. Check it out if you get a chance. It's kind of a neat feature. I also like to begin my videos with a couple of expressions that we can kind of fold back into the subject. I'm going to hit you with a couple of them. The first one is the idea of debasement. What do I mean by that? No, even though I think about it every time I hear myself say that word, I'm not talking about a room beneath the house. Debasement is the action or process of reducing the quality or value of something. This is something that all of us have experienced in our lifetimes, right? If there was a product that you used to buy and it used to be so much better than it is now, maybe they changed flavorings, maybe they changed some of the materials that they used to use, the quality is just not there. That can be seen as a form of debasement also. It's when you're reducing the quality, but this is particularly pertinent to silver and to some extent gold coins throughout history. So we'll talk about several historic examples of this idea of debasement. I wanted to give you one of probably the most famous ones before we go on with the other definitions, and that was the Great Debasement of 1544. This is when the King of England, Henry VIII, reduced the amount of his precious metals in his circulating coinage. He'd run up enormous bills, and he was trying to stretch his silver and gold as much as we can. But if you're a stacker, you know that's not an easy thing to do. He went with 23-karat gold coins at the beginning of his reign, and it was reduced all the way down to 20-karat gold by the end of his reign. But he did even worse with his silver coinage. Originally, these groats and testoons, a testoon is kind of the old word for a shilling, kind of the major silver coin that was used at the time. Those were 92.5% pure silver, somewhere right in there during the beginning of his reign. But he quickly reduced it from 92.5% down to 76% pure. And then he went down to 50% pure. And then he went down to 34% pure. At least that's the best idea that we can get off of some of these historic pieces. If you are a fan of the channel, you know that I'm constantly harping on the fact that a lot of silver and gold coins throughout history have been alloyed with other metals to make them more durable. But that wasn't what he was doing. We do that because silver and gold are actually quite soft as metals. When you add in a little bit of copper or a little bit of nickel, it makes them much, much stronger, much more durable. They can circulate without damage. Henry VIII seemed to be ignoring this, so much so that when he truly debased his own coins by adding so much more copper to them, The silver would wear away quickly, exposing the copper elements beneath it. And when you have a coin that is an image of you facing forward, the highest point on that is going to be your nose. And Henry VIII's nose wore through the silver and became a bright, shiny, coppery color. That alerted to everybody to the fact that he had debased his own coinage, but it also made him look kind of ridiculous in the eyes of the public, so much so that they started calling him Old Copper Nose because these were so prevalent, showing his bright, shiny copper nose. I think that's kind of a fun example of this. Debasement, right? That is the action or process of reducing the quality or value of something. You can compare and contrast that idea to another one, that is revaluation. So this is along the same lines, and traditionally this has been done by just suddenly saying that the coin that was worth X amount is suddenly worth X plus more, right? It kind of depends on the circumstances, but we have a great example of that too. You're looking at a large Scottish crown. That's a great big silver coin that would have circulated in Scotland. 1578, this big silver coin was revalued, not by adding more silver or making it larger, but by simply putting a counterpunch into it that is the form of that thistle that you see there. And suddenly this coin went from being worth 30 shillings to being worth 36 shillings and 9 pence. So almost 36 and a half shillings, right? That's about a 25% increase without having done anything but just marked the coin in a special way. So rulers have tried doing this for a long time too. Did either of these things really work? Did either of these forms of debasement really work? In the form of the coins, the groats, and those testoons from Henry VIII, not really, because merchants were pretty smart back then. They tested coins constantly. They knew what a coin's value was, and if your life depended on getting the right amount of product for your coins, or vice versa, selling your product for the right amount of silver, you were watching this kind of thing very carefully. And if you got lower quality coins, you simply upped the price on your things to account for that. They weren't fools. They knew what they were doing, and that wound up not really helping Henry VIII any at all. In fact, the people that it helped the most were probably counterfeiters, right? These are people whose entire industry was producing coins of a lesser quality silver. So for them to see that these coins had dropped so precipitously in value, in quality of their silver, they were jumping on this and making more and more and more counterfeits with lesser quality silver. They loved this idea. That definitely wasn't helping anybody either. So we know that this probably doesn't really ever help, at least not the way that these rulers would think it did. The last word I want to hit you with is the idea of billion. I've talked about billion a little bit recently. This is not billion. This is billion, B-I-L-L-O-N. And what it means is that an alloy of gold or silver coinage, which is actually predominantly more of a base metal than of that precious metal. And we saw that happen with Henry VIII pieces, right? He went from 92.5% pure silver down to 76% pure silver, 50% silver, and that's right at that line that separates billion from silver coins. I don't think I'd really want a low quality silver coin anyway, but at least you could say it's mostly silver. But when he dropped down beneath 50%, those pieces became billion, and billion is really kind of a derogatory term. Nobody wants billion coins. We'll see some examples of those a little bit later here. So we in the United States have experienced the same kind of thing too. So let's start with some classic American coins. Did you know that our 1 cent coins used to be massive, right? This is actually a large cent, and you can see this dates from the 1850s. But this piece, as big as it is actually smaller than the original cents that were first made by the United States in 1793. Originally, they contained 13.48 grams of copper. And that lasted until 1795, when we dropped it down to 10.89 grams of copper. So you can see that we're already going through this process of debasement, right? We're reducing the amount of copper, which is valuable. And back in the day, this would have been something, right? Copper was kind of an important commodity. In about 1850s, we realized that these pieces were just too large still, so we reduced them and we came up with the small cent. Right here, you're looking at an Indian cent. This is a much later coin, but this piece, much, much smaller, right? The smaller versions of these went all the way down to about 3.5 grams of copper. Originally, the Flying Eagle cents that came before them actually had a little bit of nickel worked into them too. But we stayed with this 3.11-ish grams of copper or bronze or whatever you want to think about it through the Indian cents all the way through the memorial cents up until 1982. And what happened in 1982? The Lincoln cents, the memorial cents in that time period went to a copper-plated zinc penny. And if you've been a metal detectorist before, or if you are a coin collector, if you're a Lincoln cent collector, these zinc cents, sometimes called zinkins, are really not a favorite of anybody. Nobody seems to like these zinc cents. They have almost no copper to them at all, right? That's 97.5% zinc and 2.5% copper. So in the last 150, 200 years, we've gone from a very large copper coin to a very small copper coin to a mostly zinc coin with a little bit of a copper wash to it. And now we have done away with it entirely. That is a good example of getting rid of some of this metal. Even though copper is not a precious metal, you can see it definitely unfolding here. Let's talk about some other examples here. We've got some of my favorites. These are the Mexican pieces of the 20th century. And if these sound familiar, I did talk about these a little bit in my Stacking Mexican Silver video series. You'll find a link to that down below too. But let's start with the 1920 to 1945 silver coin. This is a peso from Mexico. Sometimes it's called a radiant cap peso. That's a Phrygian cap with rays coming down out of it. And you can see this one's dated 1943. This one, even though it's got wild toning on it, I call this confetti toning, but you can barely make it out here at the top. It says 0.720. These pieces were originally made out of the silver standard that was popular in Mexico at 72% pure silver. Those were used from 1920 to 1945. They were 16.6 grams of 72% silver. In 1947 and 1948, Mexico realized that the amount of silver in their coinage was still a little bit too high. So in 1947, 1948, they released this peso. It is still a peso. It's still the same face value. But you can see that this one dropped down to 14 grams of 0.500 silver. That is 50% pure. So within a matter of a couple of years, 72% down to 50%. But they didn't stop there. This is a 1950 peso. This is really a one-year type. And while I am a huge fan of Mexican silver coins, I'm not trying to beat them up at all. You guys know that if you've seen my channel before, I love stacking Mexican silver. But one of the things that I like about Mexican silver is that it often tells you exactly the size, the weight, and the purity on these pieces. And you'll notice this example does not do that. I think Mexico is starting to regret this whole idea of putting the weight and the purity on their silver coins, because of this 1950 peso, 13.3 grams of 30% silver. So really, really rapidly from 45 to 47 to 1950, 72%, 50%, 30%, but they didn't stop there. This piece is particularly popular with younger stacker, newer stackers. This looks like a silver Mexican peso. Is it? These were actually made from 1957 to 1967. These look like a peso. Once again, they are denominated as a peso, but nowhere on this do you see any kind of reference to the purity of these pieces either. And that's because these later 1 peso pieces, 10% silver. So we already saw a reduction to 50%, and anything lower than that would be considered billion. But these 10% pure pieces, while they are fun to stack, they are a great big coin. You used to be able to find them crazy cheap. The fact that they're only 10% pure silver, and in fact that was largely considered to be a wash also, almost like our zinc cents. They were kind of plated with silver. You can find these pieces with the silver almost completely worn away. I don't recommend stacking those. In fact, I wouldn't recommend stacking anything other than maybe the 72% pure pieces. This was a really quick devaluation. This is a really quick debasement from 1945 to 1957. So a 12-year stretch, 72%, 50%, 30%, 10% silver. Still pesos. Each one of these is still a peso. But the silver in them has been debased to the point where they are billion, and barely even billion at that point, right? Let's take a look at some other pieces from this kind of region. We're going to go back a little bit further. We're talking about the Peruvian sol. These were made from 1964 to 1916. This is a nice size, big silver coin. You can see it compared to an American silver coin of the same era. This is a Peruvian one sol. You can see it says un sol down here at the bottom. And this piece in particular is from 1891. I said before the Mexican piece is one of the things I like about it was that they used to say the purity of the silver on it. And that's what we're looking at here too. This 0.9 is an indication to the fact that these pieces were made out of 90% pure silver in Peru. They were going with a Latin monetary union system of a big 90% silver coin. From 1923 to 1935, Peru continued to release a virtually identical coin, but if you're being really careful looking at this, it almost has a little bit of a waxy gray color to it. And that's because they reduced the quality of silver to 50%. You see that 5 right there. That's what that's a reference to. So this 1923 example, while it looks the same, while it's the same size, it's the same design front and back, it's only 50% pure silver versus the 90% pure silver of the earlier sols. Another great example of debasing the quality of the silver. Let's go up a little bit further as we're going through time. And I've got some examples of some South African pieces here. These are really cool. I like these quite a bit. We're starting with this piece here. And this is another great big silver coin. We might call these crowns generically. You guys who pay attention to the channel know that I love great big silver coins, always have. This is a South African 1948 5-shilling piece. And the reason I picked this up in the first place is the springbuck on it, which of course is the same device that's on the South African Krugerrand, right? That was a no-brainer. You get a chance to have a classic silver coin with a springbuck on it. This is a fun one to have. 1948 South African 5 shillings. This is Kraus-Mischler number 40.1, 28.20 grams of 800 fine silver. So this would be an 80% silver coin, and you're looking at King George the sixth here on the front of the coin. So we know that this was a much period of much closer ties to the UK, right? In 1964, we've got an example of what looks to be virtually an identical coin, right, to the one we just looked at. But again, you're seeing maybe a little bit of that silvery color is gone. This was when South Africa was really expressing their independence, and they went with a 50-cent piece, a denomination, rather than a 5-shilling piece like the earlier piece. And this one is just clearly much more further from the UK than it had been. But this piece, even though it is virtually identical in terms of its size and its weight, is only 500 fine silver. So we've gone from an 80% pure silver coin in 1948 to a 50% silver coin in 1964. Now, we mentioned before that one of the other ways that governments around the world have tried to debase things was to change the valuation of them. We see this piece going from shillings to cents. I think the cent denomination here is really another further break from the UK. Economists at the time will tell you that there was really no difference in value between the 5-shilling and the 50-cent piece. They had essentially the same purchasing power. But it wouldn't have surprised me if the government of South Africa had gone from a 5-shilling to a dollar amount. That would have been in keeping with a lot of the debasement that we've seen here before, increasing the value of the piece while simultaneously decreasing the quality of the silver, that debasement. Interesting examples mid-century in Africa, in South Africa. I think those are really cool too. The United States of America did not avoid this. We talked about the copper cents of the 1800s, even the 1900s, and all the way up until the current time. Did we debase our big silver coin? Well, no, not really. And that is a little bit surprising when you think about it. The United States of America has issued a silver dollar that was essentially the same size, weight, and purity from the 1700s all the way up until about 1935. And at that time, we continued to circulate these pieces. Never did we really debase them. But the key here is that the American silver dollar, for a lot of that time, those 200 odd years, was never really the primary circulating silver coin. Our biggest circulating coin for most circumstances was really probably the half dollar. This is an example of a 1964 Kennedy half dollar. But you can see just how close in size it is to the Mexican piece of about the same era. These were really a much more common piece to find, especially in the 1800s. Not many of the silver dollars circulated. The silver dollars that came before the Morgan dollar in particular was a little bit of an oddity. We never made them in very big numbers, but we did make the half dollar in very large numbers, and also the dime and the quarter. These were the main circulating coins of this period of time. There weren't very many expenses that would have cost more than maybe a dime or a quarter or a half dollar, and if they did, you had multiple examples of that. So we had about the same amount of silver in our silver coins up until about 1853. Now, if you're thinking about precious metals, does the year 1850 ring any kind of bell with you? I'm thinking about gold rushes, right? So in 1849, we had the California gold rush, and it lasted for several years. And an enormous quantity of gold was being dumped on the market. Ironically, or not ironically, the same thing happened in Australia. In 1851, they had their own gold rush, and tons and tons and tons, literally tons of gold were being dumped on the market for the first time really in the modern era. So what did this do? Lots of people have been playing the silver to gold ratio recently with the run-ups that we've seen in the value of gold and silver in the last 10 months or so. But imagine what would have happened if literally hundreds of tons of gold were suddenly entering the market that had never been there before. That skewed the ratio, and it drove way up the value of silver. Oddly enough, the value of silver skyrocketed. The ratio between gold and silver was really, really screwy. And what that meant is that all of a sudden the silver coins the United States of America had been minting all along had much, much more silver in them than the value on the coins themselves. And when that happens, people start doing screwy things. In this case, they started exporting American silver coins overseas, or just taking them, melting it down entirely, because the silver was worth more than the face value. They were making money just by destroying these coins, and that had a really negative impact on America's economy. We needed these coins to circulate for the betterment of all of our economic status. So if all of these coins started disappearing, it was really putting us in a very, very difficult position. In 1853, Congress passed the Coinage Act of 1853, and in that legislation was essentially the idea of reducing the quantity of silver in our own circulating coins about 8%. And this took place in our dimes and our quarters and our half dollars. And I just happen to have kind of a cool example. I found this piece metal detecting probably 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. And the way that we indicated that the new coins that we were releasing actually had a smaller amount of silver in them, because they looked for all intents and purposes just like the previous coins, was that in some cases we actually added a little arrow. Do you see that arrow there? And there's an arrow there on the other side of the date. And that is an indication that this piece was made out of a reduced quality of silver, a reduced quantity of silver, about 8% less. So our dimes went from 2.67 grams of silver to 2.49 grams. Quarters at 6.68, they dropped to 6.22. And our half dollars, remember that was really the main circulating silver coin at the time, they went from 13.36 grams down to 12.44 grams of silver. But the thing is that this actually worked. This debasement actually worked. It stopped the coins from being exported. The face value of these coins started to solidify and stabilize at a little bit less than the amount of silver that they had in them, or a little bit more than the amount of silver. So it became much more difficult for people to export these pieces. They weren't making any money on it anymore. It stopped the coins from disappearing. That's exactly what we wanted. But of course, the idea of putting these indicators, there were some arrays on the back of some coins also, was so that we could recall those pieces when we went back to the full amount of silver in our silver coins. Can you think of it, Congress doing something like that, right? Can you think of the American Congress saying, okay, the trouble is past, let's go back up to the full amount of silver that these pieces had always had in them? Of course not. That didn't happen. The silver in the half dollars in 1873 was increased from 12.44 grams up to 12.5. But remember, it had been 13.36. So even when we've done this as an emergency measure, Congress was still taking advantage of the fact that by increasing the value and increasing the silver content, it still wasn't nearly what it had been before this whole thing happened. The last one I want to talk about is something that's really more in my lifetime, maybe your lifetime also, and that is the 1964 Kennedy half dollars, the reason I've got these sitting here. The actual silver weight of these silver half dollars was originally 0.3617 of a troy ounce. And if you know the Kennedy half dollars, you know that the 1964 was really the last year that we made 90% pure circulating coins. And because this was a memorial issue for our slain, our assassinated president, the 1964 was the only year that these were produced as a 90% pure silver coin, at least for circulation, right? So these are a beautiful piece to have. I love having 90% silver Kennedy half dollars. Only the 1964s are 90% silver. What happened after 1964? We released the 40% silver half dollar. This is in 1969. We released these from 1965 through 1970, where the quantity of silver, the amount of silver dropped from 90% all the way down to 40%. And we have a term for that now, right? We call that billin. I know there are lots of stackers out there who are probably saying, why aren't you talking about the war nickels if you're not familiar with it? The United States of America actually needed nickel during World War II. And because of that, we took our nickel coins that we were minting and we took out some of the nickel and replaced it with silver. So we actually kind of went backwards from the way this usually happens by putting a more valuable commodity into these pieces. And because of that, I wouldn't really call that part of a devaluation. You might actually see that as increasing the value of these pieces. So 1942 through 1946-ish, our 35% pure silver nickels, our war nickels, are also a billin coin. And if you are familiar with the war nickels, you know that most of the time these manganese pieces, these nickel and silver pieces, do take on that very unattractive, darkly splotchy tone. And that's kind of a modern example of what we saw with old copper nose way back in the 1500s. With the amount of base metal in these pieces making the silver look a little bit devalued. So that's the story of 20th century debasement. If you have questions about anything that we talked about here, by all means, leave a question down below. Love the idea of debasement. Be careful about it. If you are looking for these modern silver coins, make sure that you get the right dates that have the full measure of silver or gold in them that you're supposed to. Don't get caught with one of these debased coins, right? We can see how significant that still is to this day. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, love to have you click on that subscription button, become part of this community. Go ahead and hit that notification bell also. And the reason we say that is because I premiere new videos pretty much every Friday evening, and often I go live immediately after those premieres. Maybe you are watching this video for the first time with me as a premiere on a Friday night. If you are, say hi in the chat, but definitely come to the live stream that immediately follows these premieres. The live stream is a chance to take a little bit of a deeper dive into this material, for you to be able to ask questions of me in real time, to talk with other people, including other YouTubers who often come into my live streams. This is a real fun way to kick off the weekend. I love the faster paced live streams. If you have an opportunity, please come to the next live stream. We'd love to see you in the house. I like to end my videos by saying, always be learning. And thank you for allowing me to be a part of your journey as we go deeper into the world of coins and physical precious metals.